Have you ever been embarrassed by somebody else's spiritual commitment? Have you ever been threatened by the love that somebody else seems to have for God? Um, this week, as we near the end of our series of Interrupting Jesus, we see a scene where Jesus is interrupted in a powerful way with an expression that leaves the other people somewhat puzzled. Um, and Jesus' response is very instructive to us. The first thing that we need to know as we look in Mark chapter 14 is that this is now Wednesday of the last week of Jesus' life, or sometime around there. The Passover has come. Jesus and his disciples are about to celebrate the Last Supper. Jesus has been going in and out of Jerusalem every day. He's been staying in Bethany, and Bethany was where he raised Lazarus from the dead, and he's been journeying into Jerusalem. So you have the scene with all those controversies where people are asking Jesus about, marriage after the resurrection and paying taxes to Caesar, and all of those other things where they try to trap Jesus and where he debates people. And now he goes out to Bethany, and while he is there, he has dinner at the home of Simon the leper. And it's there that Jesus is interrupted. But this time, Jesus is not interrupted with a request, and he's not interrupted by a question. He is interrupted by a gesture. Let me read. Now the Passover and the festival of unleavened bread were only 2 days away, and the chief priests and the teachers of the law were scheming to arrest Jesus secretly and kill him. But not during the festival, they said, or the people may riot. So the opposition to Jesus is reaching a fever pitch. And the religious authorities have already decided that they're going to arrest Jesus and he's going to disappear. That's their plan. They're going to arrest Jesus secretly and they're going to kill him secretly because they realize that there's actually a lot of groundswell movement for Jesus. There's a lot of people that support him. It's instructive that Mark makes it very clear that it's a small number of religious leaders and not the vast majority of Jewish people or Gentile people, but a small number of religious leaders who plot to take Jesus' life. So that's what you've got, a scene where people are opposing Jesus. And then we're going to circle around to that at the end of this passage, because you notice that they say, let's not kill Jesus during the festival. Now, those of us who have read the Gospels, we know Jesus dies. That's precisely what does happen. He gets arrested and he's crucified in the midst of the Passover celebration. But that wasn't their original plan. How does that happen? Well, Mark puts that on hold. Instead, he embeds in the middle of that story another story, and this is where Jesus is interrupted. Verse 3, while he was in Bethany, reclining at the table in a home of Simon the leper, a woman came with an alabaster jar of very expensive perfume, made of pure nard. She broke the jar and poured the perfume on his head. Some of those present were saying indignantly to one another, why this waste of perfume? It could have been sold for more than a year's wages, and the money given to the poor. And they rebuked her harshly. Leave her alone, Jesus said. Why are you bothering her? She has done a beautiful thing for me. The poor you will always have with you, and you can help them anytime you want, but you do not always have me. She did what she could. She poured perfume on my body beforehand to prepare for my burial. Truly I tell you, wherever the gospel is preached throughout the world, what she has done will also be told in memory of her. What happens is not that puzzling. How Jesus responds is a little bit more puzzling. The woman comes to Jesus. He's reclining at the table, which means he's leaning on his arm and his legs are spread out. And a woman comes and she takes an alabaster jar. Now, nard was a perfume made from the root of a tree in India, ground down, made into a perfume. It was very expensive. And it was kept in an alabaster jar. That was the best place to keep perfume. It says that she broke the jar, and she poured the perfume on Jesus' head. If she broke the jar, that meant that she wasn't using just a little perfume. It means she wasn't keeping the perfume for something else. It meant that she was lavishly pouring this perfume on Jesus' head. She was anointing him as a celebration, as an act of worship, as an act of commendation. She wanted to celebrate Jesus. Now, this alabaster jar is, as I said, very expensive. And here's a woman, we don't even know her name. We don't know how she got it. Chances are, if it's an alabaster jar that's sealed with this expensive perfume inside, then it's probably a family heirloom. It's probably something that's been passed down to her, and not something that she just earned because she had a really good quarter in sales. It's probably something that was handed down to her. And she has decided to take this perfume, which is worth so much money, save for a special occasion, break the jar so that she can't ever use it, and pour it over Jesus' head purely out of love and devotion for Jesus. Now the disciples see this, and they can't help but thinking, this is kind of a waste. We could have taken this perfume and sold it. And we could have sold it for like a year's worth of wages. I mean, that jar would take a year's worth of somebody's wages for somebody to buy. So what is that? Tens of thousands of dollars in our terms? And instead of selling it and giving the money away or whatever, she just breaks it and pours it out on Jesus. And they start to say, they say, that's a silly thing to do. So what are they saying? You've wasted your perfume on Jesus. That's what they're really saying. Jesus is not worth pouring that perfume on. You should have done something more tactically useful with your wealth. But instead of rebuking her, Jesus rebukes them. And he says, leave her alone. She has done something beautiful for me. If you want to give money to the poor, you can give money to the poor, Jesus says. If you want to sell one of your heirlooms and give it to the poor, you can sell one of your heirlooms and give it to the poor. But don't you realize, Jesus realizes, that he's only going to be with them for a few more days. And I don't know whether this woman knew Jesus was going to die or not. But Jesus sees in her gesture that one of the reasons you would anoint somebody for perfume would be at a burial. Like basically when a person dies, they didn't embalm people in those days. They poured perfume on them. And Jesus knows that he's going to die, and he knows that he's going to die a criminal. And if you die a criminal, they just throw your body into a pit, and nobody prepares it for burial. And Jesus sees her act as an act of love for him in preparation for his burial. Now, selling that perfume and giving it to the poor would not be a bad thing to do. In fact, you can't think of anything better to do than selling the perfume and giving it to the poor, especially because giving money to the poor was something that people did at Passover, and this was a Passover time. And yet Jesus says, but her devotion is still commendable. Why? Because it was a spontaneous act of her heart out of love for Jesus. Jesus would not let anyone criticize this woman because what she did out of the depth of her heart out of love for Jesus. So even something as good as giving to the poor can't be more important than just us spontaneously loving Jesus. Even doing something as good as giving and preparing for the poor is not as important as us spontaneously loving Jesus. And all she wanted to do was show love and devotion to Jesus. She broke the jar. She wasn't holding anything back. She broke her jar and she poured it out on Jesus. This is all she had. She wanted Jesus to know, everything I have, I'm giving in celebration of you. Whatever I have, I'm giving to you in worship and in celebration for you. And she didn't care what anybody thought. She didn't care what anybody else thought she should do with the money. She was giving it to Jesus. Now, were the disciples embarrassed because their love for Jesus wasn't as spontaneous? Were they embarrassed because somebody was going to have to feed the poor? And if this woman had sold it, then they would have been able to use her money and they wouldn't have to use any of their money. So in other words, was it pride? Was it guilt? Was it greed? We know that this account is relayed in John chapter 12, and John said that it was Judas who rebuked the person, and he did it because he likes money. And if they had sold it, he would have had access to the money. So John at least says at least one of them, their motive was not good. Whether all their motives were bad or not is hard to say. But I think Jesus is saying, it's not about doing something better. It's about appreciating that this woman is willing to give everything she has to show love to me. Contrast that with the religious leaders who want to kill Jesus. And contrast that with what happens right after this scene. Mark tells us in verse 10, right after this, that Judas Iscariot, one of the 12, went to the chief priests to betray them. They were delighted to hear this and promised to give him money, so he watched for an opportunity to hand him over. So in other words, you have the religious leaders that want to kill Jesus. You have the story of the woman, and then you have Judas who goes and says, I'm ready to betray Jesus. This fact, the reason that Judas betrays Jesus, is the reason that Jesus is arrested during the festival. Because Judas is saying, I'll lead you to a place that's away from all the crowds. Jesus will be alone. You can arrest him there. You can try him secretly, and he'll be dead before it's even sundown. So Passover won't even have hit. That's why they end up arresting him then, because Judas is willing to do that. But you have these two people who want to kill Jesus, and in the middle, this example of pure love. The woman, that's really the contrast. And so the question to us is, where are we in this story? Probably we're not the religious leaders who just want to do away with Jesus, who just want to ignore Jesus, who want to get rid of Jesus. But perhaps you're a person who you're tired of Jesus asking questions of your life. You just want to get him out. You just want to not think about this anymore, Or maybe Jesus is not the Savior that you want him to be. You want him to follow your agenda. That was Judas's problem. Judas wanted Jesus to follow his agenda, and Jesus wouldn't do it, so Judas betrayed him. Or more likely, we're other people in that room. We're like the other disciples, and we're saying, loving Jesus is a good thing to do, but let's not get carried away. Let's not do something embarrassing. I mean, this is an expensive bottle of perfume. She's poured it all over Jesus. What we're really saying is, let's not get too extravagant in our devotion to Jesus. And by that we really mean maybe Jesus isn't worthy of that kind of response. Those are dangerous words. When we start to say Jesus is not worthy of an emotional response, Jesus is not worthy of a selfless response, of a generous response, that we want devotion to Jesus to fit into our lives, and that somebody else's response might make us embarrassed. That's what challenges us here. Every time we see somebody weeping before God, every time we see somebody confessing something, every time we see somebody really doing business with God, and we say, I'd like somebody to pray for me. I'd like to be able to share that, but I don't want to lose it. I don't want to embarrass myself. I don't want other people to know. That's when we're the person in the room and not the person breaking the vial. Sometimes we just need to break the vial. And we need to give it all to Jesus. We just need to spontaneously tell him what we feel. We need to express that love and not worry about what other people think, not worry about fitting in, not worrying about being extravagant. Jesus said this woman's story will be told wherever the gospel is told because she had extravagant love for me. And so this last sign of interrupting is probably the best of them all, because this woman interrupted Jesus to extravagantly love him. And Jesus said, you know what? When somebody shows extravagant, generous, spontaneous love for me in worship, it's never the wrong thing to do. And I will never condemn it. Would that it be that our hearts were that spontaneous and loving.